In Luke chapter 15, Jesus tells a famous parable. Actually, 3 parables, but the end of it is become known worldwide, I think, as the parable of the prodigal son. And he tells this parable for a very particular reason, because he was surrounded at the time by a crowd of people. And in this crowd, we read that there's 2 different kinds of people. It says that there were tax collectors and sinners, all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So in this crowd, you have 2 different kinds of people. You have the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, who were moral and religious people. They were recognized in society as upstanding citizens, good people, and they would have been people who very much got the reward of society's acceptance. They were religious and moral in every way. They even counted the little leaves on their plants and gave some of that, a percentage of that, to the work of God. They worshipped at the temple. And then on the other hand, you have these other people that are considered to be very immoral in the culture and irreligious in every way. Those were tax collectors and known as sinners. And the tax collectors were working for the Roman government. They were Jews, but working for the Roman government, so they were seen as sellouts, collecting money for the Roman government. And they also often took more than what was due to them. And then they would have these big parties where they would put on these lavish affairs and eat together, flaunting their stolen money in the faces of the people that were their own countrymen. And so they were considered to be immoral and irreligious. And so you have these, on one hand, these very strict and religious and self-controlled people, and these other people who are self-indulgent, irreligious, and considered to be immoral. And if you think about it, actually, our whole world's quite a lot like that, isn't it? There's those 2 ways in the world. There are people who are very self-disciplined. They're the good kids that stay at home, obey their parents, work hard, get a great job, are pushing for some sort of success, and they're self-controlled and disciplined, and they fit within society's standards, and they get rewarded by society. And then you have a different group of people who are, I suppose, into what you can call the way of self-discovery. They are looking for adventure and spice in life. They're sometimes the bad kid that runs away from home on an adventure, gets into trouble, spends extravagantly, and wants to explore the things of life. And so into this context, Jesus comes and tells a parable that identifies both of those people in the parable. He tells 3, actually: a parable of a sheep that gets lost and is brought home by the shepherd, a parable of a coin that's lost and gets found by the owner, and then a parable of 2 sons. There's a younger brother who in the parable represents the tax collectors and the sinners. He's a self-indulgent person who says to his father, "I don't need anything that you have to offer me." He runs off and pursues his own life, and then eventually changes his mind and comes home. And then there's the older brother who represents the Pharisees and the tax collectors. He's the good boy who stays at home, who tries hard to earn his father's favor, who works on the family farm, the family business, and who stays and who obeys. And then, of course, the father in the parable representing God. So in Act 1, you see the younger brother running off, telling his father basically that he wishes he were dead, which is what he was saying when he said, "Give me my share of the estate." That would only have happened when the father died, and taking this wealth that had been won for him and bought for him, and squandering it with prostitutes and wild living, and ending up in a pigsty, wondering if he can eat what the pigs are eating. And then he has this moment of repentance and turning back to God, and the father welcomes him, and so there's this great feast and great rejoicing. But in the second act, we see the older brother standing outside this feast, refusing to go in, angry. His father has to be called out. He embarrasses his father on the greatest day of his father's life. He's waving his finger at the father, and his father makes this incredibly gracious and impassioned plea to him and invites him to come in and to keep the family whole. And then just when we're leaning into this moment of what is going to happen, because we thought that all the drama was over when the younger son was lost and then was found, and now we've got the second drama, Jesus ends the parable. He says, end a parable. The parable ends with the older brother lost. In those three parables, the sheep is lost and is brought home, and there's great rejoicing. And then the coin is lost, and the woman who lost the coin calls her friends and says, rejoice, because the coin has been found, and there's this great rejoicing. And then in the parable of the prodigal son, the younger son is lost and is found, and a banquet is prepared, and there's great rejoicing. And then the older brother stands outside and doesn't get to participate in the joy of the father. The parable ends with the bad kid found and the good kid lost. So in telling this parable, Jesus is getting right up in the face of the moral and religious and righteous people in society and saying, hey, you're lost too. You're far from God too. You have sin too. You're excluded from the community of faith too. And I just can't help but think, as we look at this parable, that Jesus is doing something so radical in terms of religious ideas. He is just blowing up all of our religious assumptions. He's coming and saying to the collective human race, everything that you thought about sin, about God, and about salvation is wrong, and I want to show you a different way. It isn't just the self-indulgent, immoral, and irreligious people who get lost. It's also the self-disciplined, the self-controlled, the moral, and the religious people who can get lost. And here's the thing, only one of them actually thinks they're lost, and only one of them knows that they're lost. The younger brother gets lost by running away and disobeying the father. The older brother gets lost by staying and obeying. Both people believe that they're right. They believe that the way that they think about the world is right. They believe that the other sort of person is wrong. And both are trying to use God for what God can give to them instead of just desiring God for himself. And God loves both of them, and God wants to bring both of them into his family by grace. Now, if you've been around a religious community at all, you know why this conversation is important and how powerful this dynamic that Jesus describes is that exists between the younger brother, the older brother, and the father, and a family and a community. There's typically two things that happen. First of all, a religious community is normally naturally attractive to older brother type people, people who consider themselves moral, who are religious, who are upstanding, who are self-disciplined. They feel like that's home for them. In fact, sometimes maybe they feel like that's the only way to be part of something in a world that's so bad, that preserves something that's good, something that they can retreat to, something that they feel they need to keep safe. And so you have religious communities like a church filling up with people who are actually lost, actually don't know God, but they feel like they're on the inside. They feel like this is their thing. And they feel the need to protect it. But at the same time, they don't feel like they need anything to change in their lives. They feel like they've earned their place there. They feel like they've earned it by staying and obeying. And so they instantly turn it into something exclusive. And at the same time, you have the second thing that's happening, and that is that the outsiders to the church, because there's so many older brothers inside a church or a religious community, the outsiders to the church feel like it's not home for them, because when they visit or hear the language that's spoken by that community, they find people who don't like weakness, people who don't like vulnerability, people who that have a selective list of sins and some are worse than others. Normally, the ones that are worse are the ones that the people inside don't have. And at the same time, these people are critical and self-righteous and hard, and yet they have spiritual explanations for pretty much every horribly unspiritual thing that they do. And so you have this tension between older brothers and younger brothers. And Jesus says, into this crowd where there's both of those people, Pharisees and teachers of the law and tax collectors and sinners who really hate each other. They both think they're right, but they're both lost. Jesus says, I'm going to build something completely different, a completely different kind of community, a community where you can't keep yourself out by feeling like you're too bad and you need to pay it back, and a community where at the same time you can't say you have the right to be in because you've worked so hard and you're so good and you're so moral and so righteous. I'm going to build a place where nobody gets to earn their way in. The only way that you get to be in is by the grace and love and kindness of the Father, an extravagant kind of Father who brings both of those people in. Imagine a community where nobody was using something to make them feel better than other people. There was no power dynamic. This is the kind of thing that Jesus said he was coming to build with all of those people in that crowd. A place where nobody got to say, I'm not good enough for God, and nobody got to say, I'm good enough for God, I've earned my way in here. A place where the common ground was simply that everybody was a sinner saved by grace, the gracious sacrifice and invitation of God, that everybody sits around this table at the Father's expense, that everybody's invited to dine and to banquet by the lavishness of his grace. It would be a place marked by gratitude, a place marked by the fact that people had been given something that none of them had deserved. And so there would be people who were just constantly full of gratitude and wanting to give to each other and serve each other. And I think a community like that just can't resist the need to give some of that gratitude and that joy away to the world around it. And this thing, this beautiful, mysterious thing that exists nowhere else in the world, Jesus says, that's what I'm coming to build, and it's called a church.